They sold him a colored bride as a cruel joke. But the giant mountain man did the unthinkable. He married her that very day. The dusty street went silent. What began as mockery became a covenant before God. But marriage was only the beginning. Because this woman carried more than scars. She carried a deed to land richer than gold. And the men who mocked her now want to take everything. Her name, her home, even her husband's freedom. Church bells ring, jail keys rattle, and a corrupt ranch boss rides hard to crush them both. But in the shadows, allies stir. A circuit preacher, a midwife, even a Ute neighbor who remembers her father's honor. As the noose of prejudice tightens, one question hangs heavy in the air. Can two outcasts, bound by faith and courage, turn a cruel joke into the greatest triumph the frontier has ever seen? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The setting sun painted long shadows across the dusty main street of the Colorado mining town. Wooden buildings creaked in the cooling evening air as boisterous men spilled out of the saloon, their pockets heavy with payday earnings. The sound of their laughter echoed off the weathered storefronts, carrying an edge of meanness that made townspeople hurry past. Sophia Mayfield stood frozen as rough hands shoved her toward the wooden boardwalk. Her travel-worn dress was still coated with stagecoach dust, having arrived from Kansas just hours before. She struggled to keep her balance, one hand clutching the small carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world. "Look what we got here, boys," a red-faced miner called out, his voice slurred. "A colored gal fresh off the stage. Reckon we ought to have ourselves an auction." More men gathered, forming a loose circle around Sophia, their faces blurred together in the fading light, some gleeful, others uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she lifted her chin high, just as her father had taught her. Still, fear shone bright in her dark eyes. "10 cents, someone shouted. "I'll bid 10 cents for a colored bride." "Make it 15, another voice joined in. Coins clinked against the wooden bar inside the saloon as the cruel game gained momentum. Sophia's fingers tightened on her bag until her knuckles went white. She thought of her father's last words before she'd left Kansas, his reminder that she carried his strength within her. But here, alone among strangers who saw her dignity as something to mock, that strength felt very far away. Edward Keene observed the scene from his position against the saloon's support post. His massive frame cast a long shadow across the boardwalk, but few noticed him. They rarely did, unless he chose to be seen. Years of solitude in the mountains had taught him the value of stillness. His scarred hands, marked by war and wilderness, gripped his weathered hat as he watched the cruelty unfold. The jeers grew louder. 20 cents for the bride. Who'll give me 25? 30 cents here. 35. Edward's jaw tightened beneath his graying beard. He'd seen enough. With deliberate movements, he straightened to his full height, well over 6 feet, and stepped into the circle of lamplight. The crowd's laughter faltered as his heavy boots thudded across the wooden planks. Without a word, Edward reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch. The sound of real silver dollars hitting the bar cut through the evening air like gunshots. 1, 2, 3 coins rolled across the scratched wood gleaming in the lamplight. "I'll marry her today." His voice was quiet but carried the weight of stone. The words fell into sudden silence as the crowd realized this was no longer a game. Sophia's trembling stilled as she turned to look at the mountain man. His eyes met hers, deep blue, steady as mountain lakes, and in them she saw neither mockery nor cruelty, but something else. Something that might have been kindness, or justice, or both. The saloon crowd shifted uncomfortably as their joke transformed into something real and solemn before them. The red-faced miner who'd started it all opened his mouth, then closed it again. Someone coughed. Another man shuffled, his feet in the dust. Edward didn't move, didn't break his gaze from Sophia's. He stood like an oak tree, patient, immovable, waiting for her response. The choice, his posture said, was hers alone. Sophia drew a deep breath, studying the man before her. His clothes were clean but worn, his face weathered by sun and wind. The scars on his hands spoke of hard work and harder battles. But it was his eyes that held her attention. The way they offered dignity instead of shame, shelter instead of mockery. The silence stretched taut as a fiddle string. Even the evening breeze seemed to hold its breath. The crowd that had gathered for cruel entertainment now found themselves witness to something entirely different. A moment of quiet courage between two souls standing against the tide of prejudice. The setting sun's last rays caught the silver dollars on the bar, making them shine like promises. $3 in silver, not a fortune, but real money, honestly offered. More than that, it was a declaration that Sophia's worth could not be measured in pennies tossed in jest, that her dignity was not a thing to be auctioned. She took one step forward, then another. Her carpet bag swung gently at her side as she moved through the parting crowd. The boards creaked beneath her feet as she approached the mountain man who had transformed mockery into marriage, with $3 silver and 7 steady words. The saloon keeper, a thin man with a waxed mustache, cleared his throat. "You serious about this, Keen?" Edward's eyes never left Sophia's face. "I am." "And you, miss?" the saloon keeper asked, addressing Sophia directly for the first time. "You willing to marry this man?" Sophia looked up at Edward Keen's weathered face, reading the quiet strength there. Her father had always told her that God worked in mysterious ways, that deliverance could come from unexpected quarters. Perhaps this was such a moment. Not the arrival she'd imagined in this mountain town, but a door opening where she'd seen only walls. "I'm willing," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart. A murmur ran through the crowd. The joke had become a covenant. The mockery transformed into a moment of genuine human connection. Those who had come to laugh found themselves witness to something that felt almost sacred in its simplicity and truth. Edward slowly extended his hand, palm up, scarred fingers open in invitation. Sophia placed her smaller hand in his, feeling the strength and gentleness in his grip. His skin was rough from work, warm despite the evening chill. "Name's Edward Keen," he said softly for her ears alone. "Sophia Mayfield," she replied, matching his quiet tone. He nodded once, accepting her name like a gift. Then he turned to the crowd, his voice carrying across the sudden stillness of the street. "Anyone here know where to find the preacher?" A young boy at the edge of the crowd piped up. "He lives behind the church, mister. Want me to run fetch him?" Edward nodded, reaching into his coat for another coin. The silver caught the last light as he flipped it to the boy. "Much obliged." The boy darted off down the street, boots raising puffs of dust. The crowd began to shift and murmur, uncertain of their role now that the entertainment had become something real and meaningful. Some began to drift away, but others stayed, perhaps sensing that they were witness to something remarkable. The red-faced miner who'd started it all slunk back into the saloon, his cruel joke having birthed something he'd never intended. A moment of grace in the gathering dusk of a frontier town. Sophia stood beside Edward, her hand still in his, feeling the steady beat of her heart begin to calm. The evening star appeared above the mountains to the east, bright and clear in the deepening blue of the sky. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she was no longer alone in this strange new place. Sometimes, she reflected, deliverance came not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet offering of $3 silver and a scarred hand extended in the darkness. The story continues with the boy running to fetch the preacher, while Edward and Sophia wait in the growing darkness, their unexpected connection forged in the crucible of cruelty, transformed by courage and compassion. Edward's large hand settled gently on Sophia's elbow, guiding her away from the saloon's harsh lamplight and jeering faces. They walked in silence down the town's main street, their boots squelching in the spring mud. The evening air carried the sweet scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys, mixing with the sharp pine smell of the surrounding mountains. Sophia wrapped her shawl tighter against the mountain chill, stealing glances at the tall stranger beside her. Edward Keen moved with the careful grace of a man used to tracking through wilderness, each step deliberate despite his size. His presence beside her felt solid, dependable as the mountains themselves. Yellow lamplight spilled from cottage windows, casting long shadows across their path. In one home, a woman rocked by the window, a child in her arms. In another, shadows moved behind curtains as a family gathered for evening meals. These glimpses of normal life made Sophia's heart ache with longing. The white clapboard church emerged from the gathering darkness, its simple cross stark against the darkening sky. Beside it stood the parsonage, a modest dwelling with a neat garden patch showing the first signs of spring growth. A single lamp burned in an upstairs window. Edward's knock echoed against the wooden door, 3 firm raps that spoke of urgency but not panic. Footsteps creaked on floorboards inside, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal Reverend Wallace wearing a hastily donned coat over his nightshirt. "Mr. Keene?" The preacher's eyes widened, then darted to Sophia. Wariness crept into his expression. "What brings you at this hour?" "Need a marriage performed," Edward said simply. "Tonight." The Reverend's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Tonight?" Surely this could wait for— "No, sir, it cannot." Edward's voice remained steady but carried an edge of steel. "There's those in town would make sport of this lady's dignity. We aim to stop that proper and legal." Reverend Wallace studied them both, taking in Sophia's fine but travel-worn dress, the carpetbag still clutched in her hand, and the quiet determination in Edward's stance. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a flash of shame for his own initial hesitation. "Please come in," he said, stepping back. "Martha," he called up the stairs. "We have need of your witness." They followed him into a small study lined with books. A coal oil lamp cast warm light over the worn desk where a Bible lay open. The preacher's wife appeared, her gray hair in a neat braid, questions in her eyes but kindness in her face. "Miss—" Reverend Wallace paused, looking at Sophia. "Mayfield," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Sophia Mayfield." "Miss Mayfield, are you entering into this marriage of your own free will?" Sophia straightened her spine, remembering her father's teachings about dignity. "I am. I came west to claim land my father deeded to me before he passed. But I find myself in need of protection I hadn't anticipated." The preacher nodded slowly, then turned to Edward. "And you, Mr. Keene? You understand marriage is a lifetime covenant before God?" "I do." Edward's response was immediate, his deep voice filling the small room. "I aim to give this lady the respect and protection she deserves." Martha Wallace moved closer to Sophia, her worn hands gentle as she helped remove the shawl. "Let me fix your collar, dear," she whispered, making small adjustments to Sophia's appearance. The simple gesture of feminine care nearly brought tears to Sophia's eyes. Reverend Wallace pulled a thick ledger from his desk, opening it to a fresh page. The scratch of his pen seemed loud in the quiet room as he recorded their names and the date. Edward produced the marriage license from his coat pocket. He must have obtained it months ago, Sophia realized, though for what purpose she couldn't guess. "Join hands, please," the preacher said, opening his Bible. The lamplight flickered as a draft stirred the pages. Edward's large hand engulfed Sophia's smaller one. She could feel the strength in his grip, but also the care he took not to press too hard. His palm was warm against hers, and she noticed his fingers trembling slightly. This mountain of a man was nervous too. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Wallace began, his voice taking on the formal tones of ceremony, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words of the ceremony washed over Sophia like a cleansing rain. She heard Edward's deep voice responding to the questions, felt her own lips forming the answers. The lamp flame danced, casting shifting shadows on the wall as they spoke the ancient vows. "I, Edward, take thee, Sophia. I, Sophia, take thee, Edward." Their voices mingled in the warm air of the study, promising to love, honor, and protect in sickness and in health, until death would part them. Sophia felt the weight of each word, the solemnity of the promises they made. This was no mockery now, but something sacred. Martha Wallace stepped forward, pressing a plain gold band into Edward's hand. Sophia didn't ask where it came from, perhaps his mother's, or bought in preparation for some other future he'd once imagined. It didn't matter. What mattered was the gentle way he slid it onto her finger, his rough hands careful as if handling something precious. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," Reverend Wallace proclaimed, closing his Bible with finality. The words hung in the air like a shield, a protection against the cruelty they'd fled. Martha brought forth a cup of tea for Sophia, pressing it into her hands. The warmth seeped through the china, steadying her trembling fingers. Edward stood nearby, signing the marriage certificate with careful strokes. His signature was surprisingly neat for a man who looked more comfortable with an axe than a pen. "God bless and keep you both," Martha said softly, embracing Sophia. The older woman's arms felt like a mother's comfort, and Sophia allowed herself to lean into it for just a moment. The night air bit sharp when they stepped outside, stars now bright in the clear mountain sky. Sophia clutched her carpet bag, suddenly uncertain. She was no longer alone, no longer unprotected, but she was now bound for life to a man she'd known for less than 2 hours. Edward stood beside her on the church steps, solid as a mountain pine. Neither spoke for a long moment, both absorbing the magnitude of what they'd done. The gold band felt foreign on Sophia's finger, its weight both comforting and terrifying. The street lay quiet now. The earlier crowd dispersed to their homes. Only the distant howl of a coyote disturbed the peace. Lamplight from the parsonage window spilled across the muddy street, a final benediction on their unconventional union. Sophia squared her shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. She had chosen this path, had spoken the vows with a clear heart. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she would meet it with the same courage that had brought her west, to claim her father's legacy. Edward shifted beside her, and she felt his coat settle around her shoulders, heavy with his warmth. The gesture, simple but thoughtful, spoke louder than words. Perhaps they were strangers still, but they were strangers bound together by choice and covenant, facing the future side by side. The stars cast silver light across the dusty road as Edward helped Sophia mount his mule. The sturdy animal shifted under their combined weight, but Edward's steady hands on the reins kept them balanced. Sophia perched sideways in front of him, her carpet bag secured behind the saddle. "It's a fair distance," Edward said quietly. "Best hold tight to the pommel." The night air bit through Sophia's thin shawl, making her shiver. Without a word, Edward shrugged out of his heavy wool coat and draped it around her shoulders. The warmth of his body still lingered in the fabric, along with the scent of wood smoke and pine. "Much obliged," she murmured, pulling it close. They rode in silence through the sleeping town, past the last flickering lamplight and into the darkness beyond. The mule's hooves made soft thuds against the packed earth, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of Sophia's heart. Every now and then the animal would pick its way carefully around a boulder or dip in the trail. The road grew rougher as they climbed into the foothills. Stands of pine trees loomed black against the star-studded sky. A coyote called in the distance, its lonely cry echoing off the mountainsides. Sophia fought to keep her eyes open, exhaustion from the long day settling deep in her bones. Edward's solid presence at her back kept her from swaying too far in either direction. His breathing was steady and calm, though she noticed how carefully he held himself to avoid crowding her. The silver ring on her finger caught the starlight, reminding her of the incredible turn her life had taken in just a few hours. After what seemed like ages, Edward spoke again, just over this rise. They crested a small hill, and Sophia saw a warm glow ahead. A log cabin sat nestled against the mountainside, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the night sky. The sight of it, lonely but welcoming, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Edward guided the mule to a small lean-to stable beside the cabin. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Sophia down. Her legs trembled from the long ride, and his hands steadied her until she found her footing. "Watch your step here," he said, leading her to the cabin's door. "Ground's uneven." He lifted the latch and pushed the door open, letting warmth and firelight spill out into the night. Sophia stepped inside, taking in the single room that would now be her home. A banked fire glowed in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Above the mantel hung a well-maintained rifle, its stock gleaming with care. Neat stacks of split firewood lined one wall, and an iron pot hung from a hook over the embers. A rough-hewn table stood to one side, a single chair pushed beneath it. In the corner, a narrow bed was made up with a single wool blanket. Everything spoke of solitude. One plate on the shelf, one cup, one set of utensils. The space was tidy but sparse, clearly the home of a man used to living alone. Edward moved past her to stoke the fire, adding a log from the pile. The flames caught quickly, filling the room with fresh warmth and light. He straightened and turned to her, his expression uncertain. "It ain't much," he said, gesturing to the room. "Never had cause to make it more than what I needed." "It's warm," Sophia replied softly, "and dry. That's plenty to be thankful for." He nodded, then moved to a small cupboard. "You must be hungry. I've got bread and jerky. Ain't much else until I can get to town proper." "That would be welcome," she said, realizing she hadn't eaten since morning. Edward pulled out a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth and a packet of dried meat. He seemed to suddenly realize he only had one plate, one chair. For a moment he stood awkward and still, clearly unsure how to proceed. Sophia stepped forward and gently took the food from his hands. "We can share the plate," she said. "And I'm happy to sit on the trunk there if you don't mind." Relief flickered across his face. He pulled out his hunting knife and carefully sliced the bread, while Sophia settled herself on the wooden trunk. The plate passed between them as they ate in companionable silence. The jerky was tough but flavorful, and the bread, though slightly stale, filled her empty stomach. "I'm sorry it's such plain fare," Edward said, watching her eat. "A woman should have better." "My father always said hunger makes the best sauce," Sophia replied with a small smile. "And I've had far plainer meals in my time." Edward's eyes softened at her words. He finished his portion quickly, then rose to check the door latch and bank the fire for the night. His movements were efficient, practiced. The routine of years lived alone. From a chest in the corner, he pulled out a bedroll and extra blanket. These he spread carefully near the hearth, building up a soft pallet with his spare clothes. "You take the bed," he said firmly when Sophia began to protest. "I'll do fine here in the rocker." The old wooden rocking chair creaked as he settled into it, his long legs stretched toward the fire. Sophia sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still wearing her travel dress. She realized suddenly that she had no nightclothes, no change of garments at all except what was in her small carpet bag. Edward seemed to sense her discomfort. Without looking at her, he spoke quietly. "I'll ride into town tomorrow, fetch whatever you need. There's a seamstress there, Mrs. Miller. She's a kind soul. Help you get sorted proper." "Thank you," Sophia said softly. She lay down on the bed, still fully dressed, and pulled the wool blanket up to her chin. The mattress was stuffed with fresh straw, and despite its narrowness, it was more comfortable than the stagecoach bench had been. The fire popped and hissed, casting warm light across the cabin's single room. In the rocking chair, Edward's breathing grew slow and steady. His head nodded forward, though his posture remained alert, even in sleep. Sophia lay awake for a long time, watching the shadows dance on the log walls. The events of the day seemed almost dreamlike now. The cruel mockery in town, Edward's unexpected intervention, the solemn ceremony in the preacher's study. Now here she was, a married woman sharing this small space with a man she barely knew. Yet something about Edward's quiet strength, his careful consideration of her comfort, eased the fear in her heart. He had defended her honor when others would have trampled it. He had given her his name, his protection, asking nothing in return. The simple ring on her finger caught the firelight. It was a strange twist of fate that had brought her here, to this cabin in the Colorado foothills. Not at all what she had planned when she set out to claim her father's land. But perhaps, she thought as sleep finally began to take her, God's plans were larger than her own. In his chair, Edward shifted slightly, the rocker creaking beneath him. Two strangers under one roof, bound by vows spoken in lamplight. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, the cabin was warm, the night was quiet, and they were no longer alone. Dawn crept over the Colorado foothills, painting the sky in shades of slate and pearl. The morning air bit sharp and cold through the cabin's single window, where frost had traced delicate patterns on the glass overnight. Sophia stirred beneath the wool blanket, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night flooded back as she watched Edward quietly build up the morning fire. He moved with the careful efficiency of long habit, adding kindling and small logs until the flames caught properly. Without a word, he pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside, leaving Sophia alone in the cabin for the first time. She sat up slowly, smoothing her rumpled dress as best she could. The sound of an axe splitting wood echoed from outside, steady, rhythmic strokes that spoke of strength and practice. Edward would be occupied for a while, she realized, giving her a chance to better understand the space that was now her home. The morning light revealed details she had missed in the previous night's shadows. Though sparse, the cabin showed signs of careful maintenance. The log walls were well chinked against drafts, the floor swept clean. A shelf near the hearth held a few items: a crude wooden cup, a tin plate, and what looked like a book bound in worn leather. Sophia crossed the room and carefully lifted the volume. It was indeed a Bible, its pages soft with age and use. Opening it gently, she found careful handwriting on the flyleaf. To Edward Keene, Christmas 1859. The inscription spoke of a time before the war, before whatever circumstances had led him to this solitary life. Below the shelf, partially hidden behind a stack of newspapers, she spotted a tin box. Her conscience warred briefly with curiosity before she lifted the lid. Inside lay a neat stack of letters, the paper yellowed and creased from multiple readings. The topmost envelope bore a military franc from 1863. The steady rhythm of the axe continued outside as Sophia carefully replaced the box, understanding now that Edward carried more history than his quiet manner suggested. A Union soldier, like her father had been, though she wondered what battles he had seen, what losses had driven him to seek peace in these mountains. The door creaked open and Edward stepped inside, arms laden with split wood. He paused when he saw her standing by the shelf, but said nothing as he stacked the logs by the hearth. Snow dusted his shoulders and his breath came in visible puffs in the cold air. "I'll get breakfast started," Sophia said, moving toward the small collection of provisions she had noticed the night before. Edward straightened, shaking his head. "No need, you should rest after yesterday, I can manage." "I don't mind," she insisted gently. "It would feel good to be useful." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Together they assembled a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee. The domestic routine felt strange, yet somehow comforting, each of them carefully navigating this new shared space. As they ate, Sophia reached for her carpet bag, which sat beside the trunk where she had placed it the night before. "There's something I should show you," she said, drawing out a leather folder tied with string. Edward set down his coffee cup, watching as she carefully untied the binding and removed several sheets of paper. The top document was covered in formal writing, with an official seal clearly visible at the bottom. "It's a deed," she explained, smoothing the paper on the table between them. "For land along the river, about 5 miles east of town. My father purchased it years ago, had it properly recorded and notarized." Edward leaned forward, studying the document with careful attention. His eyes moved methodically over the legal language, the property description, the signatures and dates. "This is good bottom land," he said finally. "Rich soil, good water access, valuable." "Yes," Sophia agreed quietly. "That's what my cousins wrote in their letters. They said I should come quickly, that there were men in town asking questions about the ownership." Edward's expression grew grave. "There are those who wouldn't hesitate to cheat you out of your rightful claim, especially—" He trailed off, but Sophia understood what remained unsaid. "Especially a colored woman on her own," she finished. "Yes, I know. That's why I came as soon as I could. My father believed in doing everything properly, legally. He taught me the same. But law doesn't always protect those it should." The fire popped in the hearth, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, snow had begun falling more heavily, dusting the window with white. "Your father was a wise man," Edward said, carefully refolding the deed. "But wisdom doesn't always stop greed. There are men in town who've had their eye on that land for years. They won't be happy to learn it belongs to you." "That's why the letters worried me so much," Sophia explained, pulling out several worn envelopes. "My cousins wrote that strangers were asking about father's will, about whether the deed had ever been properly filed. They warned me that if I didn't come soon to establish my claim, I might find it had somehow been transferred to someone else." Edward nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "And that's why you came. But traveling alone—" "I had no choice," she said softly. There was no one else to send, no one to speak for my rights. I didn't expect. She paused, her hand unconsciously touching the simple ring on her finger. I didn't expect to find myself in such a situation yesterday, or to find someone willing to stand up for a stranger. The cabin grew quiet except for the crackling of the fire. Edward sat very still, his scarred hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but firm. What's done is legal and proper now. No one can challenge your claim without going through me first. Sophia felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire or coffee. She studied this quiet mountain man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. His face remained hard to read, but there was something in his eyes, a steadiness, a depth of purpose that eased the fear she had carried since leaving Kansas. Thank you, she said simply, not just for last night, but for understanding why this matters so much. My father believed that owning land meant having a future, something to build on. He wanted that for me, even knowing how hard it might be. Edward met her gaze, and for the first time since their hasty ceremony, Sophia felt a spark of real trust kindle between them. This man might be a stranger in many ways, but he understood justice and duty, and the importance of standing firm when others would try to take what wasn't theirs. The morning light had strengthened, illuminating the cabin's interior with a pearly glow. Snow continued to fall outside, but inside, the fire kept the cold at bay. Two people who had begun the previous day as strangers now sat sharing coffee and purpose, their lives connected by unexpected circumstance and mutual need. Sophia carefully returned the deed and letters to her carpet bag, knowing that the real challenge of defending her inheritance still lay ahead. But now she had an ally, a husband-in-law and name, whose quiet strength suggested he would not easily be moved from a course he considered right. The fire needed feeding again, and Edward rose to add another log. His movements were deliberate, measured, like everything about him. As he straightened, he glanced at Sophia, and something in his expression softened just slightly. We'll need to make a trip to town soon, he said. Get you proper supplies, things you'll need, and maybe visit the land office, make sure everything's recorded as it should be. Sophia nodded, grateful for his practical approach to their unusual situation. The trust she felt growing between them was fragile but real, built on shared understanding of justice and dignity. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer facing them alone. A week passed like water over stones, each day bringing small adjustments as Edward and Sophia learned to share the cabin's confined space. The morning dawned clear and cold when Edward announced they needed supplies from town. Sophia had been expecting this, but her stomach still tightened at the thought of facing those who had witnessed her humiliation that first night. They set out early, frost crackling under the mule's hooves. Edward had fixed up an old wagon he'd traded for, making it comfortable enough with fresh hay in the bed. Sophia sat beside him on the wooden seat, wrapped in her shawl against the mountain chill. The steady clip-clop of hooves filled the silence between them. As they approached town, Edward's shoulders tensed. The main street was busy with morning traffic, wagons delivering goods, women heading to the general store, miners trudging toward the assay office. Heads turned as they passed. Some men quickly looked away while others stared openly. A few touched their hats politely, but whispers followed in their wake. Pay them no mind, Edward said quietly, though his knuckles were white on the reins. They pulled up in front of Whitaker's general store. Edward stepped down first, then offered his hand to help Sophia. She accepted it gracefully, holding her head high as she descended. Her boots had barely touched the boardwalk when the store's bell jingled and Mr. Whitaker himself appeared in the doorway. Morning, Edward said evenly, but the storekeeper's gaze was fixed on Sophia. We don't serve her kind here, Whitaker said, his voice thick with contempt. Bad enough you made a mockery of marriage, Keen, but I won't have it in my store. Edward took a step forward, his shadow falling across the shorter man. She's my wife, legal and proper, and you'll sell to her same as anyone. It ain't natural marrying across the line like that, Whitaker's lip curled. Ain't right. What ain't right is refusing service to a paying customer. Edward's voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the words. He moved closer, towering over the storekeeper. Now, my wife needs fabric for sewing and will be needing other supplies too. Whitaker's eyes darted between Edward's face and his scarred hands, which could easily wrap around a man's throat. After a long moment, he stepped aside, letting them enter. Inside, Sophia moved with quiet dignity to the fabric counter. She selected sturdy cotton and some finer cloth for mending, ignoring the way Whitaker hovered nearby, watching her every move. Edward gathered their other needs: coffee, sugar, salt, ammunition for his rifle. When it came time to pay, Whitaker named a price well above normal. Edward counted out the coins slowly, deliberately, making it clear he knew they were being overcharged but choosing not to fight over it. As they gathered their packages, Sophia noticed movement outside the window. Several children stood there, faces pressed against the glass, staring at her with undisguised curiosity. Instead of shrinking from their gaze, Sophia reached into her basket and pulled out a paper-wrapped package. Edward had wondered why she'd insisted on baking gingerbread that morning. Outside, she knelt down to their level, unwrapping the treats. "Would you like some? I made it fresh this morning." The children hesitated, looking up at their mothers who stood nearby watching. Finally, the smallest girl stepped forward, accepting a piece with a shy, "Thank you, ma'am." Her smile revealed missing front teeth. Others followed, and soon the gingerbread was being shared among small hands. Sophia spoke softly to them, asking their names, commenting on a pretty hair ribbon, admiring a toy horse one boy clutched. "Miss?" A woman in widow's black approached cautiously. "I couldn't help but notice how fine your stitching is." She gestured to the neat seams of Sophia's dress. "I've got some mending that needs doing if you're willing. I'd pay fair." "I'd be happy to help," Sophia replied warmly. "My father made sure I learned proper sewing." Then perhaps and the widow began, but her words were cut off by the thunder of hooves. 6 riders approached, led by a man whose very posture proclaimed authority. His clothes were fine, his horse expensive, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. Sophia knew immediately this must be Hale Cummings, the ranch boss Edward had warned her about. "Well, if it ain't the happy couple," Hale called out, pulling his horse to a stop. His men snickered behind him. "Tell me, Keen, how much did you pay for that joke of a marriage?" "Must have been quite a bargain." Edward's entire body went rigid. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Sophia could see the muscles in his jaw working. The children scattered, sensing danger. "Careful now," one of Hale's men taunted. "Don't want to make your new missus a widow so soon." Sophia stepped closer to Edward, laying her hand on his arm. She could feel the trembling tension in his muscles, the effort it took him not to react with violence. "We should go," she said softly. "Our supplies are loaded." For a moment, she wasn't sure he'd heard her. Then slowly, deliberately, Edward turned away from Hale and his men. He helped Sophia into the wagon, ignoring the continued jeers and laughter. "That's right, run along home," Hale called after them as Edward took up the reins. "Hope she was worth making yourself the town fool." They drove home in silence, the wagon wheels creaking over every rut and stone. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Edward unloaded their supplies, while Sophia prepared a simple supper, each of them wrapped in their own thoughts. Later, as she sat by the fire darning one of Edward's socks, Sophia finally spoke. "Today wasn't just about buying supplies, was it?" Edward looked up from where he was cleaning his rifle. "No," he admitted. "It was about showing them we won't hide." "Our marriage," Sophia said carefully, "it's become something more than just the two of us. It's a challenge to the way they think things ought to be." "Does that frighten you?" Edward asked, his voice gentle. Sophia considered the question, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Not as much as being alone did. At least now we face it together." She met his eyes across the fire. "Thank you for standing up to Mr. Whitaker today. And for walking away from Mr. Cummings. That took more courage than fighting would have." Edward nodded, understanding in his expression. They fell into comfortable silence again, but something had shifted between them. Their hasty marriage of convenience had become a partnership of purpose, a quiet defiance against those who would deny their humanity and dignity. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkening valley. Inside the cabin, 2 people who had begun as strangers continued their careful dance of learning to trust, to share space, to face a world that wished them ill. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light on their faces as they sat together, neither hiding nor fighting, but simply being who they were. Snow drifted down in lazy flakes, coating the mountain landscape in pristine white. Inside the snug cabin, Sophia stood at the rough-hewn table, kneading bread dough with practiced movements. The familiar work brought comfort, reminding her of the mornings in Missouri when she'd helped her father prepare for breakfast. The cabin smelled of yeast and wood smoke, a scent that was becoming as familiar as home. Edward's heavy boots crunched in the snow outside before he shouldered through the door, bringing a blast of cold air with him. His arms were laden with split logs for the fireplace. "Storm's coming," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "It might be stuck inside for a spell." Sophia nodded, shaping the dough into a round loaf. "I filled all the water buckets this morning. Reckon we'll manage fine." She'd learned quickly that mountain life required planning ahead. Every drop of water had to be carried from the creek, every stick of wood split and stacked, every meal made from scratch. Edward set the logs by the hearth, then watched as she scored the top of the bread with sure strokes. "You've got a good hand for that," he observed quietly. "My father believed in teaching useful skills." Sophia smiled at the memory. Said knowledge was something no one could take from you. As the bread baked, filling the cabin with its homey aroma, Sophia turned her attention to mending. Edward's work clothes took hard wear, and she'd noticed how threadbare his shirts had become. Now she sat in the rocker by the fire, carefully patching tears and reinforcing seams. Edward cleaned his rifle nearby, his movements methodical. "Might be time you learned to handle this," he said, not looking up. "For protection, when I'm away hunting." Sophia's hands stilled on her mending. "I've never touched a firearm before." "No better time to learn." Edward's voice was gentle but firm. "World ain't always kind, especially to those alone." The next morning, after the storm passed, Edward took her behind the cabin, where he'd set up targets on tree trunks. With infinite patience, he showed her how to load the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight along the barrel. His large hands adjusted her grip, steadying her aim. "Breathe slow," he instructed. "Squeeze the trigger smooth, don't jerk it." The rifle's kick surprised her, but she held firm. After several attempts, she managed to hit the target, though not center. Edward nodded approvingly. "Good. We'll practice more when weather allows." As winter deepened, they fell into comfortable rhythms. Sophia learned to split kindling with the small axe, though Edward still handled the larger logs. She discovered which local plants could be used for tea and medicine, knowledge Edward had gained from mountain living. In the evenings, they shared stories by the fire. "Tell me about your father," Edward said one night as snow whispered against the windows. "You speak of him often." Sophia's hand stilled on her sewing. "He was a chaplain in the Union Army, but before that, he taught me to read and write in secret. Said education was a way to claim your own soul." She glanced at Edward. "Were you in the war too?" Edward's face grew distant. "Infantry. Saw things no man should see." His hand unconsciously touched the scar on his neck. "Lost a lot of good friends." "Is that why you came to the mountains?" "Partly." Edward stoked the fire. Needed quiet after all that noise. Space to breathe. As he spoke about his experiences, Sophia noticed something changing in the cabin's atmosphere. Where silence had once hung heavy, conversation began to flow more easily. Sometimes she even heard Edward chuckle at small things. A chipmunk's antics. A story she told about her childhood adventures. One crisp Sunday morning, Edward appeared dressed in his best shirt, recently mended by Sophia's careful hands. "Thought we might attend service today," he said, almost shy. "If you're willing." Sophia's heart jumped, but she kept her voice steady. "I'd like that very much." She put on her good dress, the one she'd saved for special occasions, and wrapped warmly against the cold. They walked to town hand in hand, their boots crunching in the snow. The church bell rang clear across the valley, calling the faithful to worship. Heads turned as they entered the small church. Whispers rustled like dry leaves, and several people shifted away when they approached. But Reverend Wallace met them at the door with a warm handshake. "Welcome, welcome," he said, gesturing to an empty pew. "We're glad to have you join us today." Sophia sat straight-backed beside Edward, aware of the stares but refusing to shrink from them. When the first hymn began, she lifted her voice in praise. The familiar words of amazing grace filled the small space, and gradually, the whispers died away. Her clear, strong voice carried the melody, and soon others joined in. During the sermon, Sophia felt Edward's solid presence beside her, his shoulder touching hers. Reverend Wallace spoke of love and acceptance, of seeing beyond surface differences to the heart within. Whether by coincidence or divine guidance, his words seemed particularly fitting. After the service, several women approached Sophia. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, was the first to speak. "That was beautiful singing," she said warmly. "We could use another voice in the choir." "Thank you," Sophia replied, touched by the invitation. "I'd be honored." Not everyone was so welcoming. She noticed Mrs. Whitaker and several others deliberately turning away, gathering their children close as if difference might be catching. But the sting of rejection was lessened by the genuine smiles of those who did greet them. That evening, back in their cabin, Sophia prepared a hearty stew while Edward banked the fire for the night. The familiar domestic tasks felt different somehow, warmer, as if the day's events had changed something fundamental between them. Over supper, Edward spoke softly. "Been a long time since I felt peace like this." He met her eyes across the table. "Years, maybe." Sophia stirred her stew, considering his words. "Peace comes in unexpected ways sometimes," she said, "like snow covering rough ground, making everything smooth and new." Edward nodded, understanding in his expression. They ate in comfortable silence, but Sophia could feel something growing between them. Trust, perhaps, or understanding. The bond they shared was still fragile, like early spring ice on the creek, but it was strengthening day by day. Later, as she wrote in her journal by lamplight, Sophia reflected on how much had changed since that first frightening night in town. The cabin that had seemed so stark and lonely now felt like a sanctuary. Edward, once a stranger who had saved her from humiliation, had become someone she trusted, someone whose quiet strength she had come to rely on. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing their mountain world in white silence. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting warm light on two people who had found, in their unlikely union, something neither had expected: the beginnings of home. Snow crunched beneath their boots as Edward and Sophia approached the church hall on New Year's Eve. Golden light spilled from every window, and the sound of a fiddle drifted through the cold night air. Sophia paused at the bottom of the wooden steps, her hand tightening on Edward's arm. "Maybe we shouldn't," she whispered, watching shadows move behind the frosted windows. "Not everyone will want us here." Edward covered her gloved hand with his. "You've as much right as anyone," he said quietly. "More than some, I reckon." The hall had been transformed for the social. Paper chains and evergreen boughs decorated the walls, and lanterns cast warm pools of light across the wooden floor. Long tables lined one wall, laden with pies and cakes brought by the town's women. The scent of coffee and cinnamon filled the air. As they entered, conversations faltered. Some neighbors nodded politely, while others turned away, whispering behind raised hands. Sophia held her head high, though Edward felt her trembling slightly beside him. Mrs. Wallace hurried over, her face bright with welcome. "Sophia, Edward, I'm so glad you came." She took Sophia's arm. "Come see what we've done with the hall. The ladies spent all day decorating." Edward watched as the preacher's wife led Sophia toward a group of women near the refreshment tables. Some smiled tentatively, while others edged away. His jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. Change came slow in mountain towns. The fiddler struck up a lively reel and several couples took to the floor. Edward found a quiet corner where he could watch Sophia. She stood somewhat apart from the others, but Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, offered her a cup of coffee and engaged her in conversation. As the evening progressed, more townspeople arrived. Children darted between adults, playing tag despite their parents' scolding. The hall grew warm with bodies and conversation. Edward noticed how Sophia's eyes followed the little ones, especially when they paused to stare at her with undisguised curiosity. The music faded and Reverend Wallace stepped to the front of the hall. He raised his hands for attention. "Friends and neighbors, What better way to welcome the new year than with a hymn? Mrs. Wallace tells me we have someone with a particularly fine voice among us tonight. He turned toward Sophia. Mrs. Keene, would you honor us with Amazing Grace? Sophia's eyes widened. Edward saw her glance around the room, noting the mixed expressions of interest and skepticism. Mrs. Wallace touched her arm encouragingly. Please, dear. We'd love to hear you sing. After a moment's hesitation, Sophia stepped forward. The hall grew quiet, all eyes upon her. She clasped her hands before her, took a deep breath, and began to sing. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Her voice rose pure and clear in the lantern-lit space. Edward had heard her sing before, but never like this. The notes seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul, carrying all the pain and hope of her journey. The familiar words took on new meaning as they filled the hall. That saved a wretch like me. Even the children stopped their play, watching wide-eyed. Several of the miners removed their hats, heads bowed. Edward saw tears in Mrs. Wallace's eyes. The baker's wife pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. I once was lost, but now am found. As Sophia's voice soared on the final verse, something shifted in the room. Edward felt it. A softening, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended prejudice. He realized his own heart had undergone the same transformation. What had begun as an act of protection had become something far deeper. When the last note faded, silence held for a long moment. Then applause broke out, scattered at first, then spreading through the hall. Sophia's cheeks flushed as she ducked her head modestly. Several women approached her afterward, led by Mrs. Peterson. That was beautiful, truly beautiful, the baker's wife said, squeezing Sophia's hand. We've been worried about our children's schooling. The teacher left last fall, you see. Mrs. Wallace mentioned you are educated. I can read and write, Sophia acknowledged. My father made sure of that. Would you consider teaching some of the children? Mrs. Peterson asked. We could arrange lessons at my house, perhaps twice a week. Edward watched Sophia's face light up. I would be honored, she said softly, though not everyone might approve. Let them talk, Mrs. Peterson said firmly. My Tommy needs his letters more than they need their pride. The fiddler started another tune, this one slower. Edward pushed away from his corner and approached his wife. Might I have this dance? He asked, extending his hand. Sophia looked surprised, then pleased. I don't know the steps, she admitted. Neither do I, Edward said with a slight smile. We'll learn together. They moved awkwardly at first, trying to find their rhythm. Edward's large hands were gentle on her waist, and Sophia gradually relaxed into his lead. They stumbled once, bumping into another couple, and Sophia's unexpected laugh warmed something in Edward's chest. Sorry, she whispered, still smiling. I'm not very graceful. You're perfect, Edward said quietly, surprising himself with the truth of it. They danced until the fiddle played its last note. Some couples had left. Others gathered around the refreshment tables for a final cup of coffee before heading home. Edward helped Sophia with her coat, and they stepped out into the crystal-clear night. Stars blazed overhead, their light reflecting off the snow. Their boots squeaked on the packed trail as they walked home, breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Edward felt Sophia's small hand slip into his, and he squeezed it gently. Thank you, she said after a while, for bringing me tonight, for everything. Edward glanced down at her upturned face, peaceful in the starlight. No need for thanks between us, he said gruffly. They walked on in comfortable silence. The mountain night was alive with small sounds, the crack of frost-split branches, the distant cry of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Sophia matched her steps to Edward's longer stride, and he found himself shortening his pace to accommodate her. At that moment, watching her move sure-footed through the snowy night, Edward realized she had become as natural a part of his world as the mountains themselves. The thought should have frightened him, but instead it filled him with a quiet certainty. Sophia suddenly stopped, tugging his hand. Look, she whispered. A shooting star blazed across the dark sky, leaving a trail of silver light. They stood together, heads tilted back until it faded. Make a wish? Edward asked softly. Sophia squeezed his hand. No need, she said. I'm exactly where I belong. The bright promise of the church social faded like morning frost in harsh sunlight. 3 days later, Edward stood at the blacksmith's shop discussing repairs to his mule's shoes when hoofbeats thundered down the street. Hale Cummings rode up with 4 of his men, their horses' flanks lathered from hard riding. Edward's shoulders tensed as Hale dismounted. The rancher's boots struck the packed earth with deliberate force. His customary smile was nowhere to be seen, replaced by cold calculation. "Keen," Hale called out, loud enough to draw attention from passers-by. "That woman of yours has been spreading lies about owning land down by the river." Edward set down the horseshoe he'd been examining. "My wife's claim is legitimate," he said evenly. "The deed's properly signed and notarized." "Is that so?" Hale pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. The county clerk's seal was clearly visible, the ink still fresh. "These documents say different. According to official records, that parcel was sold to me 6 months ago." Edward's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough legal papers during the war to recognize a forgery, but he knew Hale's influence with the clerk would make that hard to prove. "Those papers are false," he said. "Sophia's father deeded that land to her years ago." "A colored man claiming to own prime riverfront?" Hale's laugh was sharp as a whip crack. "Now that's a tale worth telling. Your wife's either simple or criminal, spreading such nonsense." Edward's hands curled into fists. "Watch your mouth when you speak of my wife." The blacksmith, sensing trouble, retreated into his shop. Other townspeople began gathering at a safe distance, drawn by the confrontation's rising tension. Hale's men spread out, blocking Edward's path to his mule. Their hands rested casually near their gun belts. Hale stepped closer, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "That land's mine now, Keen. Your mistake was thinking you could protect her. Should have left her to the saloon crowd. At least they were only joking." Edward's control snapped. His fist shot out, catching one of Hale's men square in the jaw as the fellow reached for his pistol. The man crashed backward into a water trough, sending up a spray of icy water. The other riders surged forward. Edward's size and strength served him well, but he was outnumbered. He managed to knock another man down before someone struck him from behind with a length of wood. Pain exploded across his shoulders. "Stop, please stop." Sophia's voice cut through the commotion. She'd been at the general store and came running at the sound of fighting. Her basket of supplies tumbled forgotten in the street. As Edward turned toward her voice, 2 of Hale's men grabbed his arms. He struggled, but their combined weight held him fast. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye where a ring had caught him. "Deputies," someone shouted. "The deputies are coming." Hoofbeats approached rapidly. 2 men wearing badges reined up, hands on their weapons. Edward recognized them as frequent drinking companions of Hale's. "What's the trouble here?" the senior deputy demanded, though his eyes suggested he already knew. Hale brushed dust from his vest, composure fully restored. "Keen here attacked my men without provocation. We were merely discussing a land deed when he went wild." "That's a lie." Sophia pushed through the crowd. "They provoked him. They threatened." "Ma'am, step back," the deputy cut her off. "This isn't your concern." "She's my wife," Edward growled. "Of course it's her concern." The deputy's face hardened. "Seems to me you're causing trouble all around, Keen. First that mockery of a marriage, now starting fights in the street. Time you cooled off in jail." They produced iron manacles. Edward could have resisted, might even have broken free, but he saw the fear in Sophia's eyes and knew fighting would only make things worse. He submitted to the restraints, though his dignity never wavered. The deputies brought up the prisoner wagon. As they loaded Edward inside, Sophia ran forward. "Edward, don't let them take you." Hale's men blocked her path. She tried to push past them, tears streaming down her face, but they held her back roughly. "Edward." "Get home, Sophia," Edward called, his voice steady despite the circumstance. "I'll be all right. Just get home safe." The wagon rattled away toward the jailhouse, leaving Sophia standing alone in the muddy street. Townsfolk began to disperse, some offering sympathetic glances, others deliberately looking away. Hale mounted his horse, that calculating smile, back in place. "Best collect your things, woman," he said. "Your protector won't be around much longer, and that land belongs to me now." Sophia watched them ride away, her heart pounding. She'd seen this before in Missouri. How power and prejudice could twist justice like a copper wire. The carefully forged papers, the convenient deputies, the coordinated attack. It had all been a trap, sprung at the perfect moment. She gathered her scattered supplies with trembling hands. Mrs. Peterson hurried over to help, whispering, "Come stay with us tonight, dear. You shouldn't be alone up there." But Sophia shook her head. "Thank you, but no, I need to be home, need to think." The walk back to the cabin seemed endless. Every shadow made her jump, expecting Hale's men to emerge from the trees. But they'd made their point. She was alone now, vulnerable. They could afford to wait. Inside the cabin, everything reminded her of Edward. His coffee cup still sat on the table where he'd left it that morning. His spare shirt hung by the fire, mended by her hands just yesterday. The silence pressed in, broken only by the soft pop of embers in the hearth. As darkness fell, Sophia lit the lamp and knelt beside Edward's chair. Her father's Bible lay on the shelf nearby, its pages worn from years of faithful reading. She ran her fingers over the familiar leather cover, remembering his deep voice reading verses about justice and mercy. "Watch and pray," he used to say, "for the Lord sees all things, even when men's hearts are dark." Sophia bowed her head, tears falling freely now. "Lord," she whispered, "give me strength. Show me how to fight this battle. Edward protected me when no one else would. Now he needs my help. But I'm just one woman against so many powerful men." Her father's warnings echoed in her memory. "Justice out here bends like a willow in the wind, daughter. Those with money and influence can make the law dance to their tune. But remember, truth may bend, but it never breaks. Stand firm in what's right, and God will make a way." The cabin creaked in the winter wind. Through the window, Sophia could see stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in town, Edward lay in a cold cell, paying the price for defending her honor. She squared her shoulders, determination replacing fear. "I won't let them win," she promised to the empty room. "Whatever it takes, I'll find a way to prove the truth." She opened the Bible, seeking comfort in its familiar words. A piece of paper fluttered out, one of Edward's old letters from the war. She picked it up, studying his careful handwriting. An idea began to form. If Hale could forge documents, perhaps there was still a way to prove their legitimacy. She just had to find it before their enemies closed in completely. The night deepened around the lonely cabin. Sophia added wood to the fire and wrapped herself in Edward's coat, drawing strength from its lingering warmth. Tomorrow, she would begin her fight for justice. But tonight, she kept vigil in prayer, asking God to protect her husband and guide her path through the darkness ahead. A coyote called in the distance, its haunting cry echoing off the mountains. Sophia clutched the Bible closer, her father's words sustaining her through the long hours until dawn. She would need all her courage for what lay ahead. Morning crept over the mountains, painting the frost-covered ground in shades of pink and gold. Sophia had barely slept, her prayers and worries keeping her awake through the long night. She dressed carefully in her best dress, the blue cotton one she'd mended so carefully, and wrapped her father's worn shawl around her shoulders. The walk to town felt longer than usual without Edward beside her. Wind whistled through the pines, and her boots crunched on frozen mud. She clutched her father's Bible close, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. The jailhouse sat at the end of Main Street, a squat building of rough-hewn logs with barred windows. Deputy Mills dozed in a chair by the door, his badge gleaming dully in the morning light. He startled awake at her approach. "Ma'am?" His hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "I've come to see my husband," Sophia said, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "Edward Keene." The deputy's face twisted with distaste. "Ain't proper visiting hours." "Please." Sophia met his eyes. "Just for a moment?" Something in her quiet dignity made him shift uncomfortably. He stood, jingling his keys. 5 minutes. That's all." The cell block smelled of damp straw and unwashed bodies. Edward sat on a narrow cot, his broad shoulders hunched in the confined space. He jumped up when he saw her, moving to grip the iron bars. "Sophia, are you all right? Did anyone trouble you?" His face was bruised, a dark purple spreading above his eye where he'd been struck. But his eyes were clear and focused entirely on her welfare. Sophia's heart ached at his concern. I'm fine, she assured him, reaching through the bars to touch his roughened hand. But what about you? Have they treated you properly? Edward's attempt at a smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Don't waste worry on me. Listen, whatever happens, don't give up that land. It's rightfully yours. Hale and his men, they'll try to pressure you, maybe threaten worse than before. But that deed is legal. Your father made sure of it. Time's up, Deputy Mills called from the doorway. Edward. Sophia tightened her grip on his fingers. I'll find a way to prove the truth, I promise. Just stay safe, he urged, his voice dropping lower. That's what matters most. I couldn't bear it if… Out now, the deputy interrupted, taking Sophia's arm. I love you, she whispered quickly, the words surprising them both. In all their weeks of marriage, neither had spoken them aloud. Edward's eyes widened. His fingers brushed hers one last time before the deputy pulled her away. God keep you, Sophia, he called after her. Outside, Sophia paused to collect herself, blinking back tears. The morning had grown colder, clouds gathering over the mountains. She turned her steps toward the small clapboard church where Reverend Wallace lived with his wife. The preacher answered her knock, his kind face creasing with concern when he saw her. Mrs. Keene, please come in. Martha just made coffee. Inside the warm parlor, Mrs. Wallace fussed over Sophia, pressing a cup into her hands and clucking sympathetically about Edward's arrest. The Reverend settled into his chair, Bible open on his knee. I've already written to Judge Parker, he said. He's due for circuit court next month, but… He hesitated. But Hale has influence with him. Sophia finished quietly. I fear so. The Reverend sighed. The ranch boss employs half the town, one way or another. His word carries weight, even with the law. What should I do? Sophia asked. Edward is innocent, those land papers Hale showed. They're forgeries. My father's deed is genuine. I believe you. Reverend Wallace leaned forward earnestly, but proving it will take time. We must be patient, trust in the Lord's timing. I'll speak with the judge myself when he arrives. Tell him how you and Edward have conducted yourselves with nothing but dignity. A month is a long time, Sophia murmured, thinking of Edward in that cramped cell. Mrs. Wallace patted her hand. Stay with us, dear. It's not safe for you alone up there. But Sophia shook her head. Thank you, but no. That cabin is our home. I won't be driven from it. The Reverend nodded slowly. You're a brave woman, Mrs. Keene. We'll be praying for you both. Leaving the parsonage, Sophia had to pass the general store. A group of women stood gossiping outside, their voices carrying clearly. Shameful business, that marriage. Never should have been allowed. Reverend Wallace had no right to perform it. Goes against nature, if you ask me. Won't hold up in court anyway. Judge Parker will set things straight. Sophia walked past with her chin high, though each word stung like a physical blow. She felt their stares boring into her back, heard their whispers follow her down the street. The long walk home gave her too much time to dwell on their cruel predictions. What if they were right? What if the judge declared her marriage invalid? She'd seen it happen before. Laws twisted to serve those in power. Justice denied to those deemed unworthy. The cabin looked smaller somehow without Edward's presence. No smoke rose from the chimney, no warmth waited inside. Sophia built up the fire with hands that had grown skilled at the task. She heated soup and cut a slice of bread, but food held little appeal. As darkness gathered outside, she lit the lamp that had become her nightly companion. Its gentle glow couldn't fill the empty spaces where Edward should be. His chair by the fire, his boots by the door, his quiet voice sharing stories of the day's work. Sophia took down her father's Bible, settling into Edward's chair. The leather cover was smooth from years of handling, the pages marked with her father's careful notes. She traced his firm handwriting in the margins, remembering how he'd taught her to read from these very pages. For the Lord loves justice, and she read aloud, finding comfort in the familiar words. He will not forsake his faithful ones. Her father had believed that with all his heart, even when others mocked his education of a daughter, even when war divided their world. He'd taught her to stand tall, to trust in God's timing while working for what was right. I won't let them win, Papa, she whispered to the quiet room. I won't let them take what's rightfully ours. The cabin creaked in the wind, reminding her of its solitude. But as Sophia prepared for another night alone, she felt stronger than before. Edward's love, her father's teachings, and her own determined faith would see her through whatever trials lay ahead. She blew out the lamp and lay down on their narrow bed, pulling Edward's quilt close around her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she would rest in the promise of justice, praying for strength to face whatever morning might bring. 3 days had passed since Sophia's visit to the jail. The mountain winter pressed close around the cabin, frost etching delicate patterns on the windows each morning. She kept the fire burning, but loneliness weighed heavier than the cold. A knock at the door startled her from her mending. Sarah Miller, the widow who had approached her in town, stood on the step with 2 children peeking from behind her skirts. "Mrs. Keene," Sarah said hesitantly, "I hope we're not disturbing you." "Not at all." Sophia opened the door wider. "Please, come in from the cold." The children, a girl of about 10 and a boy perhaps 7, stared wide-eyed at the cabin's interior. Their clothes were clean but patched, telling the story of a family making do after loss. "I've been thinking on your offer to help with sewing," Sarah said, settling the children by the fire. "And well, I wondered if maybe you might teach Tommy and Marie their letters too. I can pay with eggs and butter." Sophia's heart lifted at the simple request. "I would be honored. When would you like to begin?" "Now?" Marie asked eagerly, pulling a slate from under her shawl. Sarah colored. "If it's not too forward, now is perfect." Sophia cleared space at the table, mind already organizing lessons from her own schooling. "Do they know any letters already?" While Sarah watched from Edward's chair, Sophia spent the next hour guiding small fingers through the alphabet. Tommy struggled, but persisted, while Marie showed a quick mind for reading. Their mother beamed with pride at each small victory. "Same time tomorrow?" Sarah asked as they prepared to leave. "And I might have mentioned to my sister about the lessons. Her 3 would be eager to learn too." "The more the better," Sophia said warmly. "Teaching will help pass the time while—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Sarah squeezed her hand. "We're praying for Mr. Keene. Not everyone agrees with what's happened." Word spread quickly through the scattered homesteads. By week's end, Sophia had 6 students gathering each afternoon around her table. Besides the Miller children, there were the Preston twins, young Lucy Walker, and Benjamin Thompson, whose mother traded fresh bread for his lessons. The cabin rang with young voices reciting letters and simple words. Sophia found herself looking forward to each day, planning lessons and celebrating small triumphs. The children's presence drove back the shadows of worry, if only for a few hours. Between lessons, she visited Edward when allowed. The jail visits were always too brief, supervised by disapproving deputies. Edward looked more worn each time, though he tried to hide it with brave smiles. "The children are learning well," she told him through the bars. "Little Tommy mastered his name yesterday." "You always said you wanted to teach," Edward's voice was rough from disuse. "Seems God works in strange ways." "He does indeed." Sophia wanted to reach through and smooth the lines of fatigue from his face. "Reverend Wallace says the judge—" "And don't get your hopes up about the judge," and that Edward interrupted gently. "Just keep safe. That's all I ask." The deputy's boot scuff warned their time was ending. Sophia walked home slowly, prayer a constant whisper in her heart. That evening, as purple dusk settled over the mountains, a different knock came at her door. Sophia approached cautiously, Edward's rifle close at hand as he'd taught her. "Who's there?" "Joseph," came the calm reply, "friend to your father." Sophia opened the door to find a Ute man standing quietly in the gathering dark. His bearing was dignified, his English clear and measured. "Please come in," she said, remembering Edward's mentions of native neighbors who sometimes traded with him. Joseph entered, removing his hat. He declined the offered chair, choosing instead to stand near the fire. His dark eyes took in the scattered slates and primers from the afternoon's lessons. "I knew your father," he said after a moment, "Matthew Mayfield. He traded fairly with my people when others did not." Sophia's heart jumped. "You knew Papa, he never mentioned—" "He respected our ways," Joseph continued. "Did not speak of us to townfolk who might cause trouble. But he helped my sister's son when fever came, gave medicine, asked nothing in return." Tears pricked Sophia's eyes at this unexpected glimpse of her father's character. That sounds like him. He believed in helping wherever need arose. Joseph nodded. I have watched, seen how the town treats you and your husband. Not right. He paused, choosing words carefully. I was there when your father bought this land. Saw him pay fair price, mark the papers proper. If judge comes, I will speak this truth. You would do that, Sophia whispered, even knowing how some folks feel about Indian testimony? Joseph's smile held no bitterness. Yes, truth must be told, even when ears are closed. Your father understood this. Sophia blinked back tears. Thank you. I can't say what this means. My camp is by the river, Joseph said, moving toward the door. If trouble comes, signal with smoke like this. He demonstrated a pattern with his hands. We will watch. After he left, Sophia sat long by the fire, feeling less alone than she had in days. Her father's influence reached further than she'd known, touching lives across the divisions others created. His example of fairness and dignity had planted seeds of friendship that still bore fruit. The next afternoon, as children's voices filled the cabin with reading lessons, Sophia felt hope stirring anew. Sarah Miller and the other mothers might disapprove of Joseph's offer, but they trusted her with their children's learning. The Reverend Wallace still spoke up for justice despite pressure to stay silent. Even the town's prejudice couldn't stop small kindnesses from growing. Tommy struggled through sounding out a difficult word, his face screwed up with concentration. Sophia guided him patiently, remembering her father doing the same for her. Education had been his gift to her. Now she could pass it on, building bridges word by word. Very good, she praised as Tommy finally conquered the challenge. The boy's proud smile reminded her of Edward's rare grins. Somewhere in the jail, he was holding on to hope too. Together, they would weather this storm, supported by unexpected allies and the strength of simple truths. As evening approached and the last student departed, Sophia tidied away the lesson materials. Through the window, she could see smoke rising from Joseph's distant camp, a reminder that she was not alone in believing justice could prevail. Her father's legacy lived on in more ways than one. She lit the lamp and opened her Bible to read as she did each night. But this time, the words of comfort seemed closer, more real. God's providence worked through many hands, a widow's trust, children's eagerness to learn, a Ute man's honorable memory. Even in the darkest times, light found ways to shine through. Word rippled through town like wind across prairie grass. The territorial court would hear Hale's claim to Sophia's land in 3 days' time. Some folks whispered it was already decided, that money and influence would triumph over truth. Others held their tongues, watching and waiting. Sophia spent hours at the cabin table, carefully arranging her father's papers in the lamplight. The deed bore his firm signature, each letter written with the same dignity he'd taught her. The notary's seal remained clear and official, pressed into paper that had yellowed with age but lost none of its legal weight. She traced the boundaries described in the document, good bottomland along the river, with water rights that made it precious in this dry country. Other papers told their own story, letters from her father describing the purchase, receipts for the money paid, even a carefully drawn map showing survey markers. Sophia organized everything meticulously, the way Papa had taught her during his years as regiment chaplain. Documents are weapons of truth, he'd said. Keep them ordered and ready. Sarah Miller stopped by with fresh bread and worry in her eyes. You'll need to dress fine for court, she fretted, studying Sophia's worn clothing. I've a blue wool dress might fit, with just a bit of taking in. That's kind, but I'll wear my own, Sophia replied, smoothing her simple black dress. Papa always said dignity comes from bearing, not borrowed finery. The widow nodded slowly. You sound just like him sometimes. He'd be proud seeing you stand up like this. Sophia's throat tightened. I hope so. The next morning, she made her way to the jail, papers clutched to her chest. The deputy barely glanced up as she signed the visitor's book, her signature neat and confident beside scrawled marks and shaky X's. Edward stood as she approached his cell, worry etching deeper lines around his eyes. Through the bars, she showed him each document, explaining their significance. His big, scarred hands touched the papers gently. "You've prepared well," he said quietly, "better than most lawyers I've seen." Papa made sure I could read law books, not just Bible verses. Sophia managed a small smile. Said knowledge was armor against those who'd try to keep us down. Edward's weathered face softened. He was right about that and about raising a daughter with more courage than most men I know. His voice roughened. More than I expected, truth be told. That night in the saloon. "You showed courage too," Sophia reminded him, standing up when others only laughed. "That wasn't courage, that was," he paused, searching for words. "That was seeing something wrong and knowing I'd hate myself forever if I stayed quiet." Sophia reached through the bars to squeeze his hand. "That's what courage is, Edward. Doing right even when it costs, dear." The deputy's boot scuff warned their time was ending. Edward held her fingers tight for a moment. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud to be your husband." Sophia walked home through the bustling street, head high despite the stares and whispers. Women drew children aside, men turned their backs. But she noticed other things too. Quick nods from the miners she'd nursed through fever. Shy waves from her reading students, a quiet God bless from the widow's porch. That evening, Reverend Wallace came to the cabin. He sat in Edward's chair, Bible on his knee, choosing words with care. "The judge is a fair man, mostly," he said, "but he's under pressure to keep peace with powerful folks. Hale's been spreading money and threats around town like manure in spring." "Will you still speak for us?" Sophia asked quietly. "Of course," and the preacher's tired face firmed. "I've been too careful about rocking boats lately. Time to remember who I really answer to." Dawn broke clear and cold on hearing day. Sophia dressed carefully in her black dress, doing her hair neat and proper. She packed the documents in Edward's old leather map case, tucking her father's Bible alongside them. The courthouse was already crowded when she arrived. Townsfolk packed the wooden benches, creating a low buzz of conversation that died as she walked down the center aisle. She felt the weight of every stare, but kept her steps measured and dignified. Reverend Wallace rose to meet her, gesturing to the seat he'd saved in the front row. Behind them, whispers rustled like dry leaves. The widow and several of her reading students' mothers slipped in quietly, settling nearby in silent support. The side door banged open as Hale strutted in, fancy vest stretched tight across his belly. His cronies trailed behind, including the county clerk who'd helped forge the false papers. They took their places across the aisle, Hale smirking as he waved his documents for all to see. Right at 9 o'clock, the territorial judge entered. He was a lean man with sharp eyes and iron-gray hair, his black robe somewhat dusty from circuit riding. Everyone stood as he took his seat behind the scarred wooden bench. "Case of Cummings versus Mayfield," he announced, shuffling papers. "Dispute over land title and water rights." His gaze swept the courtroom. "Let's keep this civil and orderly." Hale's lawyer rose first, smooth as a snake oil salesman. He presented their claim that the land had never been properly sold, that Sophia's father had merely leased grazing rights. The forged documents were laid out with flourish. "Furthermore," the lawyer added with false concern, "we question whether a colored woman can legally own property in this territory, regardless of alleged papers." A murmur ran through the crowd. Sophia's hands tightened on her father's Bible, but she kept her face calm. The judge's expression never changed as he examined Hale's documents. "And the defendant?" he asked, looking at Sophia. "Do you have representation?" She stood straight and proper. "I will speak for myself, Your Honor, if the court permits." The judge studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Proceed." Sophia moved to the front, setting out her papers with the same precision Papa had taught her. Her voice came clear and steady as she began. "I have here the original deed of sale properly notarized showing my father's purchase of this land 7 years ago. Also receipts for payment in full, witnessed statements from the previous owner, and official survey documents." One by one, she presented her evidence. The judge examined each paper carefully, comparing signatures and seals. When she explained how her father had chosen the location for its good water and fertile soil, meaning to build a legacy for his family, several women in the crowd dabbed at their eyes. "I note these documents all appear genuine," the judge said finally. "The notary seal is one I recognize from a respected office in Kansas Territory." Hale's lawyer jumped up. "But, Your Honor, surely you can't accept—" "I can and do accept valid legal documents," the judge cut in sharply. The law makes no distinction about the race of property owners in this territory. He fixed the lawyer with a stern look. Though I'm curious about these, alternative papers you've presented. The ink seems remarkably fresh for documents supposedly 7 years old. A stir went through the courtroom. Hale's face darkened as he whispered urgently to his lawyer. The county clerk suddenly found somewhere else to be, slipping out the back door. If it please the court, Reverend Wallace stood up. I can testify that I've seen the original deed in question multiple times over the past months. The signature matches others I've seen from Chaplain Mayfield during the war. The judge nodded thoughtfully. The court also recognizes Joseph Two Rivers, he said, causing heads to turn as the Ute man rose from his place near the door. You have something to add? I saw the land sale, Joseph said clearly. Saw money paid, papers signed. Matthew Mayfield was honest man. His word was true. Sophia hadn't known Joseph would come. Gratitude brought tears to her eyes as she remembered his promise to speak truth. The judge was writing rapidly in his notebook. A sudden commotion at the back drew all eyes. Edward stood in the doorway, deputy beside him, still wearing his jail clothes but freshly shaved. The judge glanced up, frowning. Your Honor, the deputy said quickly. The prisoner asked to witness the proceedings. He's given his word to behave. After a moment, the judge nodded. Edward moved to stand behind Sophia, his tall presence lending silent strength. She could feel his pride warming her back like sunshine. The territorial judge leaned forward in his chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he surveyed the crowded courtroom. Morning light streamed through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The buzz of whispered conversations died away as Hale's lawyer approached the bench, his boots clicking against the floorboards. Your Honor, the lawyer began, spreading papers across the scarred wooden surface with practiced flourish. My client holds clear title to this valuable parcel. He tapped the documents with one manicured finger. As you can see, the previous owner merely leased grazing rights to Matthew Mayfield. The land itself remained under different ownership. The county clerk, Marcus Wheeler, shuffled forward when called. His usual swagger was subdued as he raised his right hand to swear his oath. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead despite the morning chill. These documents passed through my office, Wheeler testified, avoiding Sophia's steady gaze. Everything appears proper and legally recorded. He tugged at his collar, voice growing hoarse. The lease agreement is quite clear. Sophia sat straight-backed in her chair, hands folded carefully in her lap. The Bible's worn leather was smooth beneath her fingers as she waited her turn. Edward's presence behind her lent silent strength, though the clank of his chains made her heart ache. When the judge motioned her forward, Sophia rose with quiet dignity. She spread her father's original deed on the bench, the yellowed paper crinkling softly. If it please the court, she began, her voice clear and steady. I would like to read the actual deed of sale, recorded and notarized in Lawrence, Kansas Territory, on the 15th day of May, 1862. The judge nodded and Sophia began to read. Her father's familiar handwriting flowed across the page as she spoke each carefully penned word. The formal language of property transfer, the precise description of boundaries, the witness signatures all stood in stark contrast to Hale's hastily forged documents. Note the official seal here, Your Honor, Sophia said, pointing to the notary's mark pressed deep into the paper. And here, the survey registration numbers that match the Territorial Land Office records. A rustle of interest moved through the crowd as the judge examined the seal through his spectacles. Hale shifted uneasily in his chair, shooting dark glances at the county clerk. Furthermore, Sophia continued, drawing out another document, I have here the original bank draft showing payment in full, witnessed by 3 different parties. She laid it beside the deed. The dates and amounts align perfectly with the sale agreement. The judge's eyebrows rose as he compared the papers. These appear quite thorough, he remarked, running one finger along the neat columns of figures. Most land transactions I see aren't documented half so carefully. My father believed in doing things proper and legal, Sophia said quietly. He taught me the same. A movement near the back of the room drew all eyes. Joseph Two Rivers stood, his dignified bearing commanding attention despite his simple dress. He moved forward with measured steps, stopping beside Sophia. "I asked to speak," he said clearly, meeting the judge's gaze. The judge studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "The court recognizes Joseph Two Rivers. You have knowledge of this matter?" "I do." Joseph's voice carried to every corner of the hushed room. "I was there when Matthew Mayfield bought this land, saw money change hands, saw papers signed." He gestured to the deed on the bench. "Those are the same papers. I remember the eagle seal." Hale surged to his feet, face mottled with rage. "You're going to take the word of some Indian over proper documents?" he sputtered. "He's lying. They're all lying." "Silence," the judge's gavel cracked sharply. "One more outburst and you'll be held in contempt." He turned back to Joseph. "Continue, please." Joseph nodded gravely. "Matthew Mayfield was honest man, treated my people with respect when others did not, showed us the boundaries he had bought, asked permission to cross our hunting grounds." His dark eyes met Sophia's. "His daughter is same, honest, respectful. The land is hers by right." Sophia blinked back tears at this unexpected support. Behind her, she heard Edward's quiet intake of breath. The judge was examining the documents again, holding Hale's papers beside Sophia's deed. "Interesting," he murmured. "Most interesting." He looked up at the county clerk, who had begun edging toward the door. "Mr. Wheeler, perhaps you could explain why the ink on your recorded documents shows no age or fading, despite supposedly being 7 years old." Wheeler's face went pale. He looked frantically at Hale, who was gripping the railing with white-knuckled hands. There might have been some confusion in the recording," Wheeler stammered. "Confusion?" The judge's voice was sharp as a whip. "Or deliberate fraud?" He shuffled through the papers again. "I note that several signatures on these newer documents bear remarkable similarity to each other, almost as if the same hand wrote them all." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Wheeler bolted for the door but was caught by 2 deputies. Hale's lawyer began gathering his papers, distancing himself from his client. "Your Honor," Hale blustered, "this is outrageous. I'm a respected rancher. You can't possibly—" "I can and I will," the judge cut in. "The evidence of fraudulent documents is clear." He turned to Sophia, his stern face softening slightly. "Mrs. Mayfield, your father's deed appears entirely legitimate. The dates, signatures, and seals are all authentic." He raised his voice to address the whole room. "This court finds in favor of the defendant. The land belongs legally and rightfully to Sophia Mayfield." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The widow who had first befriended Sophia smiled broadly, while her children bounced in their seats with excitement. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am ordering an investigation into this attempt to defraud the court." He fixed Hale with a steely glare. "Charges will be filed against all parties involved in creating and presenting false documents." Deputies moved forward to take Hale into custody. The rancher's bluster crumbled as the gravity of his situation became clear. The county clerk was already being led away in handcuffs, head bowed. "One more matter," the judge said, turning to where Edward stood with his guard. "Given that Mr. Keene's arrest appears to have been part of this fraudulent scheme, I am ordering his immediate release." He smiled slightly. "Go home with your wife, sir. Your land is safe now." The deputy unlocked Edward's chains. They fell away with a clatter that echoed through the suddenly quiet courtroom. Edward stepped forward to stand beside Sophia, his large hand engulfing hers as their fingers twined together. Reverend Wallace was the first to congratulate them, his weathered face beaming. "Justice has been served," he said warmly, "though I suspect the Lord had a hand in bringing it about." Joseph approached next, inclining his head respectfully. "Your father would be proud," he told Sophia. "You have honored his memory well." More townspeople gathered around, offering quiet words of support or simply nodding in acknowledgement. The mood had shifted palpably, respect replacing the previous scorn and suspicion. Sophia gathered her precious documents, tucking them carefully into Edward's leather case along with her father's Bible. Her hands trembled slightly as the impact of their victory began to sink in. "Ready to go home?" Edward asked softly, his deep voice rough with emotion. Sophia looked up at him, seeing the pride and tenderness in his eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Let's go home." They walked out of the courthouse together, heads high, while behind them the judge continued issuing orders for Hale's prosecution. The morning sun felt warm on their faces as they stepped into the street. Their long battle was finally over. The land, and their future, was secure at last. Hale's face twisted with desperate rage as he saw his scheme crumbling. He jabbed a finger toward Edward, his voice rising to fill the crowded courtroom. "Your Honor, you can't let this man keep custody of her. He's violent, a danger to everyone." Murmurs rippled through the gathered townsfolk. Hale pressed his advantage, spinning to face the crowd. "You all saw him brawling in the street. A man who solves problems with his fists. Is that who should have authority over a woman's property?" Edward's chains clinked as he shifted in his seat. His weathered face remained calm, though his jaw tightened. Sophia reached for his hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "He was arrested for assault," Hale continued, gaining confidence. "Ask the deputies who locked him up. Ask the men he attacked. This mountain man's no better than a wild animal. He'll turn on her next, mark my words." The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Even some who had seemed sympathetic to Sophia now cast uncertain glances at Edward's imposing figure and scarred hands. Edward slowly rose to his feet, the chains at his wrists rattling in the sudden quiet. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge studied him thoughtfully, then nodded. "You may." Edward's deep voice carried clearly through the room, though he spoke softly. "It's true I fought that day. I won't deny it." He paused, looking down at his chained hands. "I've seen enough violence in my life to know it solves nothing. But when men threaten my wife, mock her, try to drive her from her rightful home, I'll stand in their way." He turned to face the crowd, his eyes finding familiar faces. "You all know me. 15 years I've lived peaceful in these hills, trading fair, helping when needed. Never started trouble." His gaze settled on Hale. "But I won't stand idle while others make trouble, especially for those who can't defend themselves." Sophia squeezed his hand, pride shining in her eyes. Edward's voice grew stronger. "My wife is educated, graceful, kind, everything I'm not. She teaches your children, shares what she has, treats all with respect." He looked down at her with gentle reverence. "She's shown me that true strength isn't in fists or fury. It's in standing firm for what's right, in mercy rather than vengeance." Several women nodded, including the preacher's wife. The widow whose children Sophia taught dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I fought that day because I saw no choice," Edward continued. "But my wife, she's fought with dignity, with truth, with faith that justice would prevail." He faced the judge. "She's the one who deserves this land, Your Honor. Not because she's my wife, but because she's proven herself worthy of her father's legacy." The judge nodded slowly, gathering the papers before him. "I have reviewed all evidence presented." His stern gaze swept the courtroom. The original deed, witnessed signatures, and bank records clearly establish Sophia Mayfield's legal claim to the disputed property. He lifted Hale's documents. While these more recent papers show clear signs of forgery and fraud, he straightened in his chair. "This court rules in favor of Sophia Mayfield. The land is legally hers, as recorded in the original deed." The gavel struck with finality. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted. Several people cheered, including Sophia's students. Others muttered darkly, gathering their coats. The preacher's wife hurried forward to embrace Sophia, while Reverend Wallace shook Edward's hand. Hale stood rigid, his face mottled red with fury. "This isn't over," he snarled. "No one crosses me and prospers. No one." He spun on his heel, shoving past his lawyer toward the door. "You'll regret this. All of you." The threat hung in the air as he stormed out, his boots thundering down the courthouse steps. but his words seemed to carry less weight now, like the impotent rage of a defeated man. The judge rapped his gavel again. "Deputies, remove Mr. Keene's chains. He's free to go." He smiled slightly at Sophia. "Congratulations, Mrs. Mayfield. Your father would be proud of how you've handled yourself." As the chains fell away, Edward rubbed his wrists, then gathered Sophia close. She pressed her face against his chest, shoulders shaking with relief. Around them, the courtroom slowly emptied. Some people stopping to offer quiet congratulations, others hurrying past without meeting their eyes. Joseph Two Rivers approached, touching his hand to his heart in greeting. "Truth has prevailed," he said simply. "The land will be well cared for in your hands." Sophia lifted her tear-stained face. "Thank you for speaking up, for remembering my father." "Some things should not be forgotten," Joseph replied, "like honor and justice." He nodded to them both, then walked away with dignified steps. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Edward and Sophia emerged into the crisp mountain air. Their fingers intertwined, both still trembling from the intensity of the trial. Townsfolk gathered in small clusters, their reactions as divided as during the hearing. Mrs. Wallace, the preacher's wife, approached with tears in her eyes. "The Lord's justice prevailed today," she said, embracing Sophia warmly. Several others followed. The widow whose children Sophia taught, a gruff miner who'd traded with Edward for years, even the blacksmith's apprentice who'd witnessed the brawl. "You showed real grit, both of you," the blacksmith said, shaking Edward's hand firmly. But not everyone shared their joy. Across the street, Hale's supporters muttered darkly, their hostile glares promising the battle wasn't truly over. Edward drew Sophia closer, shielding her from their bitterness as they walked toward home. That evening, the cabin glowed with warmth and flickering lamplight. Edward stirred the hearty stew while Sophia sliced fresh bread, the familiar routine soothing their frayed nerves. As they settled at the table, snow began falling outside, dusting the window panes with delicate crystals. "I almost ran away," Sophia admitted softly, her spoon pausing halfway to her lips. "That first night in jail, I was so afraid." Edward reached across the table, his scarred hand covering hers. "Your courage shames me. You stood firm when I couldn't." They moved to the hearth after supper, watching the flames dance. Edward's voice grew rough with emotion. "After the war, I thought my life was done. Just existing, not living." He gazed at her, wonder in his eyes. "Never thought God had more planned for me than solitude." Sophia leaned against his shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. "I've never felt as safe as I do right here, with you." The fire crackled softly as snow continued falling outside, blanketing their mountain home in peaceful white. Their bond, tested by prejudice and strengthened by trust, had grown into something neither had expected that first desperate night. True love, born of courage and faith. Spring burst across the valley in waves of green, dotting the meadows with tiny wildflowers. Along the river's edge, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air as Edward and Sophia worked side by side on their new cabin. "Mind those nails," Edward called out, steadying a beam while Sophia measured carefully. She had learned quickly, her small hands just as capable as his larger ones when it came to precise work. Throughout the warm days, wagons arrived bringing help. Joseph and his family brought dried meat and knowledge of the best fishing spots. Widow Matthews and her children carried fresh baked bread and extra tools. Even the miners who had once jeered now offered strong backs and skilled hands for the building. Children darted between the workers, their laughter carrying across the fields where Sophia had taught them their letters months before. They gathered flowers and helped fetch water, proud to be part of something bigger than themselves. On a bright Sunday morning, Reverend Wallace stood before the half-built cabin. "Let this land be blessed," he prayed, his voice carrying over the assembled neighbors. "May it stand as testament to what can grow when hearts open to understanding." Sophia's garden took shape near the kitchen door, neat rows of vegetables and herbs promising future harvests. Edward set posts and stretched wire for the livestock pasture, planning ahead for cattle and horses. Each evening's progress showed in their tired smiles and dirt-streaked faces. The town's attitude had shifted like the seasons. Those who once whispered now spoke openly of how the couple had earned their place through quiet dignity and hard work. Hale's shadow rarely darkened the town streets anymore, his influence fading like winter frost in morning sun. As twilight settled over their land, Edward and Sophia rested on their new porch, fingers intertwined. The river caught the day's last light, glittering like scattered gold. Their home stood as more than shelter. It had become a bridge between peoples, a symbol of what could be built when hands joined in common cause. The summer evening air hung sweet with wildflowers as neighbors made their way up the path to Edward and Sophia's cabin. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies through the gathering dusk, carried by families coming together for the hymn sing. Inside, lamps cast a warm glow through the windows, spilling golden light onto the packed earth of the yard. Women arranged plates of sugar cookies and fresh bread on the long table Edward had built, while children chased each other through patches of tall grass. Joseph and his family settled near the porch, nodding respectfully to Edward. The miners who'd once jeered now stood shoulder to shoulder with farmers and trappers, their differences forgotten in the spirit of community. Sophia stood in the doorway, her face glowing with welcome. When Reverend Wallace opened his hymnal, she stepped forward to lead the singing. Her voice, clear and strong, lifted amazing grace into the twilight. The notes carried across the valley, echoing off the distant mountains. Edward watched from his place by the wall, his weathered face softened with pride. Leaning close to Reverend Wallace, he whispered words that caught in his throat. "They tried to sell me a joke, but God gave me a wife." The crowd that had once been divided now joined as one voice, harmony rising into the star-speckled sky. Young and old, native and settler, all lifted their voices together. Children paused in their play to listen, while gray-haired elders shared knowing smiles and stories of their own journeys west. The cabin stood as a beacon in the growing darkness, its windows bright with lamplight and fellowship. The river murmured its endless song nearby, its waters reflecting the evening stars, a reminder of life's constant renewal. Edward moved to stand beside Sophia, their shoulders touching. No one mocked them now. Respect had replaced ridicule. Their bond, tested by prejudice and strengthened by faith, stood unbreakable. Together, they watched their community unite in song, their dream of belonging finally made real. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.